Rejected by her own blood, a young woman finds herself standing at the edge of despair until a widower's quiet kindness offers her something she never dared to hope for, a place to belong. The autumn wind swept through Thornfield Crossing with the kind of cold that settled into the bones and refused to leave. Beatrice stood in the doorway of her aunt's house, her hands trembling not from the chill, but from the weight of the words still hanging in the air between them. "You are no longer welcome here," Aunt Constance had said, her voice as sharp as the frost creeping across the windows. "Your mother may have been my sister, but she made her choices, and you are the consequence of them." Beatrice had heard variations of this judgment throughout her life, whispered behind gloved hands at Sunday services, muttered across market stalls when she passed. But hearing it spoken so plainly, so finally by the woman who had raised her after her parents died, that was different. That cut deeper than any rumor ever could. She had tried to be useful, tried to earn her place. Every morning before dawn, she scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. She mended her cousins' dresses by candlelight, her eyes straining in the dim glow. She tended the chickens, hauled water from the well, and never once complained when Lydia and Margaret took credit for her work. But it was never enough. "Perhaps if you had any prospects," her Uncle Herbert had added, not even looking up from his newspaper. "But no man of standing would take a girl with your circumstances." Circumstances. That was the word they used when they meant shame, when they meant the mystery of her birth, the whispers about her mother's past, the absence of a father's name on any document that mattered. Now Beatrice stood on the dirt road with a single carpet bag containing everything she owned, 2 dresses, a hairbrush that had been her mother's, and a book of pressed flowers she had collected as a child. The house behind her, the only home she had known, had already closed its door. The village of Thornfield Crossing stretched before her, small and unforgiving. She knew every face, every window, every whispered opinion. There would be no charity here, no helping hand extended. The pastor's wife had made that clear when Beatrice asked about work at the church. The general store owner had turned her away without explanation. Even the boarding house had suddenly become full the moment she inquired about a room. She began walking, though she had nowhere to go. Her feet carried her past the church with its white steeple, past the schoolhouse where she had once dreamed of teaching, past the rows of modest homes where families sat down to supper together. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold that seemed too beautiful for such a bitter day. At the edge of town, where the road forked toward the outlying farms, Beatrice finally stopped. Her legs ached, and her throat burned with unshed tears. She would not cry. She had promised herself that much. A wagon approached from the north road, pulled by a sturdy mare. The driver was a man she recognized but had never spoken to. Nathaniel Thorpe, the widower who lived on the old Thornfield property. She had seen him at market sometimes, always quiet, always alone. People said he had lost his wife some years back, that he kept to himself and his land, that he was decent but distant. The wagon slowed as it neared her. "Evening," Nathaniel said, his voice low and unhurried. He was older than Beatrice, with silver threading through his hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of both sorrow and kindness. "You look like you could use a ride somewhere." Beatrice hesitated. She had learned not to trust easy kindness. It often came with expectations she could not meet, but the alternative was standing here until darkness fell completely, and she had no lantern, no plan, no place to shelter for the night. "I don't know where I'm going," she admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. Nathaniel nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Well, I'm headed home. There's a barn that needs tending, chickens that need feeding, and a stove that could use a woman's touch if you're willing to work for supper and a warm place to sleep." It was not charity. It was an offer of labor, of exchange. Beatrice understood that language. She climbed onto the wagon without another word. They rode in silence as the sun disappeared behind the hills. The road wound through fields of harvested wheat, past stone fences and grazing cattle. Nathaniel did not ask questions, did not pry into why a young woman was walking alone at dusk with everything she owned. For that, Beatrice was grateful. The Thornfield property appeared as the last light faded, a simple farmhouse with a wide porch, a red barn, and fields that stretched toward a line of dark trees. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lanterns glowed in the windows. It looked like the kind of place where a person could breathe, where silence was not hostile, but peaceful. "You can stay in the guest room tonight," Nathaniel said as he helped her down from the wagon. "Tomorrow we'll sort out what needs doing." Beatrice wanted to thank him, wanted to explain that she would work harder than anyone he had ever employed, that she would prove herself worthy of this unexpected mercy. But the words tangled in her chest, knotted with too many emotions to name. Instead, she simply nodded and followed him inside, where the warmth of the stove wrapped around her like the embrace she had been denied for so long. That night, lying in a bed that smelled of lavender and clean linen, Beatrice allowed herself to hope, just a little, that perhaps the world held more kindness than she had been taught to expect. The morning light came soft through the window, and for a moment Beatrice forgot where she was. Then she remembered the wagon ride, the kindness of a stranger, the warmth of a home that was not hers but had welcomed her anyway. She rose quickly, braiding her hair with practiced efficiency. Whatever debt she owed for this shelter, she would begin repaying it immediately. The kitchen was empty when she entered, but the stove was already burning, and a kettle sat waiting. Beatrice found flour, eggs, and a jar of preserves. Within an hour she had prepared breakfast, fresh bread, scrambled eggs and tea, brewed strong enough to chase away the morning chill. Nathaniel came in from the barn just as she was setting the table. He stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "I didn't expect," he began, then seemed to reconsider. "Thank you. It's been a long time since anyone cooked in this kitchen." They ate in comfortable silence. Beatrice noticed the worn spots on his shirt cuffs, the careful way he buttered his bread, the sadness that lived in the corners of his eyes even when he smiled. This was a man acquainted with loss, someone who understood what it meant to carry grief quietly. After breakfast, Nathaniel showed her around the property. The farm was larger than she had realized, fields that needed harvesting, a vegetable garden overrun with weeds, chickens that scattered at their approach, and a dairy cow that lowed mournfully from the pasture. "I've been managing alone since my wife passed," Nathaniel explained as they walked, "but there's more work than one person can handle. If you're willing to stay on, there's plenty to do. I can offer room, board, and a small wage." Beatrice's throat tightened. A wage, not charity but earned income, the dignity of honest work. "I'll stay," she said, "as long as you'll have me." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. Relief, perhaps, or recognition. "Then we have an arrangement." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. Beatrice rose before dawn to tend the chickens and gather eggs. She weeded the garden, harvested the last of the autumn vegetables, and learned to milk the cow under Nathaniel's patient instruction. In the evenings, she cooked meals that filled the farmhouse with warmth and the kind of comfort that had been absent for too long. Nathaniel proved to be a man of few words, but genuine kindness. He did not pry into her past, did not question why a young woman would accept work on a lonely farm. Instead, he taught her how to mend fence posts, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to coax stubborn vegetables from stubborn soil. One afternoon, while organizing the attic, Beatrice found a trunk filled with women's clothing, dresses far finer than anything she had ever owned. She ran her fingers over the fabric, silk and lace that spoke of a life very different from her own. "Those were Margaret's," Nathaniel said from the doorway. She had not heard him approach. "My wife. She came from a good family in the city. Her parents thought she was marrying beneath her station when she chose me." Beatrice closed the trunk carefully. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding." He moved closer, his eyes distant with memory. She was beautiful and kind, but she was never truly happy here. The isolation wore on her, I think. She missed the society, the gatherings, the life she left behind. When the fever took her, part of me wondered if she had simply tired of fighting against a life that never quite fit. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Beatrice understood that weight, the burden of never quite belonging, of feeling like an intrusion in spaces where others moved with ease. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the world makes us feel like we're too much or not enough. But maybe we're just in the wrong places, with the wrong people." Nathaniel's gaze sharpened, seeing her, truly seeing her, for perhaps the first time. "You're wise beyond your years." "I've had good teachers," she replied, though her voice carried an edge of bitterness. "Pain teaches quickly." That Sunday, Nathaniel invited her to accompany him to church. Beatrice hesitated, knowing what awaited her there. The stares, the whispers, the judgment that followed her like a shadow. But Nathaniel's steady presence gave her courage. The moment they entered the chapel, silence fell like a stone into water. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Beatrice felt the weight of every gaze, every unspoken question. There, in the third pew, sat Aunt Constance with Lydia and Margaret, their expressions hardening the moment they recognized her. Nathaniel guided Beatrice to a seat near the front, his hand gentle but firm on her elbow. He did not acknowledge the whispers, did not flinch beneath the scrutiny. He simply sat beside her, a quiet statement of solidarity that spoke louder than any defense. After the service, Aunt Constance approached, her face tight with disapproval. "Nathaniel Thorpe, I must speak with you about your arrangement." "Mrs. Ashford," Nathaniel replied, his tone polite but unyielding. "Miss Beatrice is employed on my farm. She works hard and earns her keep. I don't see that it's anyone's concern but ours. But surely you understand how it looks, a young woman, living unchaperoned." "I understand that idle talk says more about the speakers than the subjects," Nathaniel interrupted. "Good day, Mrs. Ashford." He offered Beatrice his arm, and they walked out together, leaving a chapel full of shocked faces and indignant murmurs in their wake. On the ride home, Beatrice finally asked the question that had been burning in her chest. "Why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me, about my circumstances." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, the reins loose in his hands, as the mare plodded along the familiar road. "When Margaret died, this whole town came calling with casseroles and condolences. But the moment I was no longer grieving in the way they expected, they stopped coming. They decided I was too distant, too cold, not grateful enough for their charity. I learned then that kindness is often conditional, offered only when it costs nothing and asks for nothing in return." He glanced at her, and in his eyes she saw the reflection of her own pain, the ache of rejection, the weariness of never being enough. "You looked like someone who needed kindness without conditions," he continued, "and maybe I needed to give it." Beatrice felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been sealed shut for so long she had forgotten it existed. Hope, trust, the possibility that she might be worthy of both. "Thank you," she whispered, and this time she meant it with every fractured piece of her heart. The weeks that followed the church incident brought change to Thornfield Crossing, though not the kind Beatrice had expected. Instead of backing away, the village seemed to lean closer, watching with sharper eyes, whispering with sharper tongues. The general store owner refused to sell Nathaniel supplies unless he came alone. The blacksmith made excuses when repairs were needed. Even the pastor, who had always greeted Nathaniel with warmth, now offered only tight-lipped nods during their encounters. But Nathaniel bore it all with the same quiet dignity he showed everything else. He traveled to the next town for goods, mended what could be mended himself, and stopped attending Sunday services altogether. Beatrice watched this transformation with growing guilt. He was being punished for his kindness to her, and she could do nothing to stop it. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Beatrice finally spoke the words that had been building inside her for days. "You should send me away," she said quietly, "before you lose everything because of me." Nathaniel looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Is that what you think? That I'm losing something? The whole village has turned against you. Your reputation—" "My reputation," he interrupted, a hint of something almost like amusement in his voice, "was never as solid as people pretended. I was tolerated because Margaret came from a respected family. When she died, I became just another lonely farmer. The village's disapproval says more about their character than mine." Beatrice twisted her hands in her lap. "But surely it matters. Surely you need them. For trade, for help during harvest." "What I need," Nathaniel said, setting aside his work and leaning forward, "is to live with a clear conscience. I've spent too many years trying to be what others expected. It cost me my wife's happiness. It nearly cost me my own. I won't make that mistake again." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that went deeper than the surface conversation. Beatrice felt something shift in the air, a recognition passing between them. Two people who had spent their lives being molded by others' expectations, finally choosing their own paths. The next morning brought rain, heavy and relentless. Beatrice spent the day inside, baking bread and mending clothes, while water drummed against the windows. Nathaniel worked in the barn, returning at midday soaked through and shivering. "You need to get warm," Beatrice insisted, already stoking the fire and heating water for tea. "Those clothes will make you sick." While he changed, she prepared a hot meal and set out dry blankets. When he emerged, wrapped in a quilt with his hair still damp, he looked younger somehow, less guarded, more vulnerable. They sat together by the fire, steam rising from their teacups, and for the first time Beatrice felt brave enough to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Why did Margaret really leave the city? You said her family thought she was marrying beneath her station, but that's not the whole story, is it?" Nathaniel was quiet for so long that Beatrice thought he might not answer. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "She was promised to someone else," he finally said, "a banker's son, wealthy and connected. But Margaret was headstrong, romantic. She believed in love, in choosing her own path. When we met at a harvest fair, she decided I was that path. We married quickly before her family could stop us. But she regretted it. Not at first. At first she was happy, or at least she convinced herself she was. But over time, the reality of farm life wore her down. The isolation, the hard work, the absence of the society she had known. She tried to hide it, tried to be content, but I could see her fading, like a flower transplanted into the wrong soil. Beatrice understood that feeling all too well. The slow suffocation of living a life that didn't fit, of trying to bloom where you were planted even when the ground was hostile. "Do you think," she asked carefully, "that it's possible to find the right soil, or are some of us just meant to struggle wherever we're planted?" Nathaniel turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Not pity, not sympathy, but recognition, hope. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes we have to create our own soil, build our own ground from scratch. It's harder than finding a place that's already prepared for us, but what grows there is stronger for it." Before Beatrice could respond, a sharp knock shattered the moment. They both froze, exchanging glances. Visitors were rare, and given the current climate in the village, unexpected company was unlikely to be friendly. Nathaniel opened the door to find a boy of perhaps 12, rain-soaked and breathless, his face pale with urgency. "Mr. Thorpe, sir," the boy gasped. "It's the widow Henshaw. She's taken ill, terrible sick, and there's no one to help her. Ma sent me because she said you were the only one who might still have a Christian heart." Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "Beatrice, gather whatever herbs and remedies we have. We're going." Within minutes they were in the wagon, racing through the rain toward the far edge of the village where the widow Henshaw lived in a cottage barely larger than a shed. The old woman had been kind to Beatrice once, years ago, before Aunt Constance forbade any association. They found her burning with fever, alone and delirious. Without a word, Beatrice and Nathaniel fell into rhythm, one cooling her brow while the other prepared medicine, one keeping watch while the other tended the fire. They worked through the night, and somewhere in those dark hours, as rain pounded the roof and lamplight flickered against the walls, something deepened between them. It was not spoken. It did not need to be. When dawn came and the fever finally broke, the widow Henshaw opened her eyes to find them still there, exhausted but steadfast. Tears tracked down her weathered cheeks. "Bless you both," she whispered. "The Lord sees what others refuse to." On the ride home, with the sun rising pale and clean after the storm, Nathaniel reached across the wagon seat and took Beatrice's hand. It was a simple gesture, nothing improper, but it spoke volumes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying, for helping, for being exactly who you are." Beatrice looked down at their joined hands, his calloused and strong, hers work-worn but steady, and felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten its name: peace. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping across Thornfield Crossing with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. Snow buried the roads, ice coated the trees, and the world shrank to the space between the farmhouse and the barn. Beatrice had never known such peace. Despite the cold, despite the isolation, she felt warmer here than she ever had in her aunt's house. Nathaniel had begun teaching her to read the almanac, to understand the language of seasons and soil. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in companionable silence. But peace, Beatrice had learned, was a fragile thing. The letter arrived on a morning when the world was white and still. A rider from the village brought it, his face carefully blank as he handed the envelope to Nathaniel and rode away without a word. Beatrice watched from the window as Nathaniel read, saw his shoulders stiffen, his jaw tighten. When he came inside, he laid the letter on the table between them. "It's from the village council," he said quietly. "They're concerned about our arrangement. They're suggesting it would be more appropriate if you found lodging elsewhere." Beatrice felt the floor tilt beneath her. Suggesting or demanding? They're threatening to bring charges. Moral impropriety. They claim that a young woman living unchaperoned with an unmarried man is a scandal that affects the entire community's standing. "But I work here. I earn my keep." "They don't care about facts," Nathaniel said, and there was an edge to his voice she had never heard before. Not anger exactly, but something deeper. Frustration. Pain. "They've already decided what this is." Beatrice stood, her hands trembling. "Then I'll go, tonight. I'll find somewhere." "Where?" Nathaniel's question cut through her panic. "Where will you go, Beatrice? Back to your aunt who expelled you? To another village where you know no one and have no references? Into the winter cold with nothing but a carpet-bag and hope?" She had no answer. They both knew there was nowhere for her to go. "There is one solution," Nathaniel said slowly, and something in his tone made Beatrice's heart stumble. "We could marry." "Aye," the word hung in the air between them, enormous and impossible. "I know it's not what either of us imagined," he continued, speaking quickly now, as if afraid to stop. "I know you're young, that you deserve courtship and romance, and all the things a woman should have before making such a choice, but it would be legal, it would protect you. And I promise you, Beatrice, I would expect nothing except what you were willing to give. It would be a marriage of convenience if that's all you wanted." Beatrice stared at him, her mind racing. Marriage. To Nathaniel. The idea should have terrified her, should have felt like another prison, another set of expectations she could never meet. But instead, she felt something else entirely, something that had been growing quietly in her chest for weeks, fed by shared meals and gentle conversations and the simple miracle of being seen. "And if it's not?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it's more than convenience?" Nathaniel's eyes met hers, and in them she saw everything he had been too careful to say, the loneliness he had carried since Margaret's death, the hope he was afraid to name, the possibility of something neither of them had dared to imagine. "Then we'll face that together," he said. "When you're ready, if you're ever ready. I won't rush you, Beatrice. I won't push for anything you're not willing to give." Before she could respond, another knock shattered the moment. This time, it was not a boy with an urgent message, but Aunt Constance herself, accompanied by Pastor Whitfield and two men Beatrice recognized as village council members. "We've come to discuss this situation," Aunt Constance announced, pushing past Nathaniel without invitation. Her eyes landed on Beatrice with cold triumph. "This farce has gone on long enough." "Mrs. Ashford," Nathaniel said, his voice dangerously calm, "you're not welcome in my home." "Your home," Constance laughed, a brittle sound. "This is about protecting what remains of this family's reputation. Beatrice is still my responsibility, regardless of how she's chosen to disgrace herself." "I'm not your responsibility," Beatrice said, finding her voice. "You made that clear when you threw me out. Because you refused to know your place." Constance's composure cracked, revealing the venom beneath. "Your mother made her mistakes, and you inherited every one of them. Do you even know what she was, what she did?" "That's enough." Nathaniel stepped between them, but Constance was not finished. "Her mother was the landowner's daughter," Constance said, each word aimed like a blade. "She fell in love with a stable hand, got herself with child, and when her father discovered it, she was cast out, married off quickly to my sister's husband's brother to cover the shame. But everyone knew, everyone always knew what she was, and what you are." The room tilted. Beatrice felt the words land like physical blows, each one confirming what she had always suspected, but never been told. Illegitimate, born of scandal, the shame her family had carried, the secret they had made her bear. "Get out," Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through the ringing in Beatrice's ears. "All of you, get out of my house." "We're not leaving without the girl," one of the council members said. "We have a legal duty." "You have nothing," Nathaniel interrupted. "Beatrice is an adult, free to make her own choices, and she chooses to stay here as my wife." The room fell silent. "We're getting married," Nathaniel continued, looking directly at Pastor Whitfield. "Today, if you'll perform the ceremony. If not, we'll ride to the next county and find someone who will. Either way, this matter is settled." Beatrice's heart thundered in her chest. She should have been terrified. She should have felt trapped. Instead, she felt something breaking open inside her, not shattering, but unfurling, like a flower that had been pressed flat in a book, suddenly remembering how to bloom. She stepped forward, taking Nathaniel's hand. His fingers closed around hers, steady and sure. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she had ever heard it. "We're getting married. And whatever my mother was, whatever I am, that's my truth to carry, not yours. Not anymore." Aunt Constance's face went white, then red. "You'll regret this, both of you." "The only thing I regret," Beatrice replied, "is the years I spent believing I needed your approval to exist." After they left, defeated, furious, but unable to argue with the simple fact of two adults choosing marriage, Beatrice and Nathaniel stood alone in the quiet kitchen. Snow fell outside the windows, soft and relentless. "You don't have to do this," Beatrice said. "You don't have to marry me to protect me." "I know," Nathaniel replied. "But maybe I'm not just protecting you. Maybe I'm choosing something I want for the first time in longer than I can remember." He lifted their joined hands, studying the way they fit together, his scarred and weathered, hers smaller but no less strong. "The question is," he said softly, "what do you want, Beatrice? Not what you think you should want, not what would be practical or safe. What do you actually want?" Beatrice looked at this man who had given her shelter when she had none, work when she needed dignity, defense when the world turned against her. She thought about the peace she felt in his presence, the way silence between them felt like its own kind of conversation, the possibility of building something real from the broken pieces they both carried. "I want," she said slowly, each word a small act of courage, "to stay. not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I choose to be, with you." Something in Nathaniel's expression shifted, relief and joy and a tenderness that made her chest ache. "Then we'll go to the pastor tomorrow," he said, "and we'll do this properly. Not because they're forcing us, but because we're choosing it." That night, Beatrice lay awake in her room, thinking about choices and chances, about mothers and daughters, about the strange path that had led her from shame to something that felt remarkably like hope. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering everything in white, old tracks disappearing, new paths waiting to be made. Dawn broke clear and cold on the morning of the wedding. Beatrice stood at the window of her room, soon to be their room, watching the world transform under the winter sun. Everything looked different in this light, sharper and more real, as if the universe itself was paying attention. She wore a dress that had belonged to Margaret, altered to fit her smaller frame. Nathaniel had brought it to her the night before, his eyes uncertain. "I know it's not ideal," he had said quietly, "wearing another woman's dress on your wedding day, but it's the finest thing I have to offer, and I want you to have something beautiful, something that says you matter." Beatrice had taken the dress with trembling hands, understanding what he was really saying, that this was not about replacing Margaret, but about honoring Beatrice, about giving her what she had never been given, the acknowledgement that she deserved beautiful things, special moments, dignity. The dress was pale blue, simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs. When Beatrice looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked so different, but because for the first time in her life she looked like she belonged to herself. A knock at the door pulled her from her reflection. She expected Nathaniel, but instead found the widow Henshaw, wrapped in a thick shawl and carrying a small bundle. "I heard what you're doing today," the old woman said, her eyes bright. "And I couldn't let you go to your wedding without something old, something borrowed." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a delicate veil, yellowed with age but still beautiful. "This was my mother's. She wore it when she married my father against her family's wishes. Seems fitting that you should wear it now." Beatrice's throat tightened. "I can't, it's too precious." "Child," Widow Henshaw interrupted gently, "precious things are meant to be used. They're meant to mark the moments that matter. Let this be yours." The ceremony was to be held at the farm itself. Nathaniel had decided that if the village would not welcome them, they would not beg for acceptance. Pastor Whitfield had agreed to come, more out of duty than approval, but it was enough. When Beatrice descended the stairs, she found Nathaniel waiting in the parlor, dressed in his best suit, his hair combed back, his hands clasped nervously. The moment he saw her, something in his expression broke open. Wonder and tenderness, and something deeper that made her chest ache. "You're beautiful," he said, and the simple honesty in his voice meant more than any elaborate compliment ever could. Pastor Whitfield arrived with his wife, both of them formal and distant. But before the ceremony could begin, the sound of approaching wagons drew everyone to the windows. Beatrice's heart sank, expecting more interference, more judgment. Instead, she saw a sight that nearly brought her to her knees. Widow Henshaw had returned, but not alone. Behind her came a dozen others, farmers from the outlying properties, the family whose child Nathaniel had once helped through a difficult winter, the merchant from the next town who had always treated them fairly, people who had watched the village turn cruel and decided they would stand on a different side. They came bearing food, flowers from preserved winter stores, and simple gifts wrapped in brown paper. They came to bear witness, to say without words that goodness deserved support, that love mattered more than reputation, that some choices were worth defending. Aunt Constance was not among them. Lydia and the cousins, who had once looked down on Beatrice, did not come, but their absence no longer carved holes in her chest. She had learned that family was not always blood, that belonging could be built rather than inherited. The ceremony itself was simple. Nathaniel and Beatrice stood before the pastor in their own parlor, surrounded by friends they had not known they had, and spoke vows that felt less like promises to tradition and more like truth finally being spoken aloud. "I take you," Nathaniel said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "not because circumstances demand it, not because propriety requires it, but because I choose you, because you have taught me that second chances exist, that kindness returns when you least expect it, that hope is stronger than grief." When it was Beatrice's turn, she looked at this man who had given her everything without asking for anything in return, and felt the last walls around her heart finally crumble. "I take you," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "because you saw me when I was invisible, because you defended me when no one else would, because you gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, the chance to choose my own life, and I choose this. I choose you. I choose us." When Pastor Whitfield pronounced them married, Nathaniel cupped Beatrice's face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of patience, of respect, of a future they would build together one careful day at a time. The gathering afterward was modest but warm. The visitors stayed for a simple meal, sharing stories and laughter that filled the farmhouse with a kind of joy it had not known in years. As twilight approached and the guests began to depart, each one offered their blessings, their support, their promise to stand with the young couple against whatever judgment might still come. When the last wagon disappeared down the snow-covered road, Beatrice and Nathaniel stood together on the porch, watching the sun set in shades of gold and crimson. "Are you afraid?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "Of what comes next?" Beatrice considered the question. A month ago, she would have been terrified. A month ago, she had been a girl with no home, no future, no voice. But standing here now, married to a man who had proven his worth in patience and kindness, surrounded by evidence that goodness could win, she felt something entirely different. "No," she said, threading her fingers through his. "I'm not afraid. For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid." That night, they sat by the fire as husband and wife, talking softly about plans for the spring planting, about the chickens that needed tending, about the ordinary beautiful future stretching before them. When Nathaniel finally walked Beatrice to their room, she had insisted on taking time, and he had agreed without question. He kissed her forehead with a reverence that made her feel cherished beyond measure. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for seeing me." "Thank you," he replied, "for staying, for choosing this life, for making this house a home again." Alone in the darkness, Beatrice lay in bed, listening to the winter wind howl outside, knowing that morning would bring work and challenges and the continued disapproval of those who could not understand what she and Nathaniel had built. But none of that mattered anymore. She had spent her entire life being told she was too much or not enough, that she carried shame in her very bones, that she would never belong anywhere that mattered. And now, in this simple farmhouse at the edge of a village that had rejected her, she had discovered the truth that changed everything. Belonging was not something you earned from others. It was something you claimed for yourself. She had been humiliated by those who should have loved her. She had been cast out by those who should have protected her. But in losing everything, she had found something far more precious. A home built not on blood or obligation, but on choice and respect and the quiet, transformative power of genuine love. The girl who had once stood on a dusty road with nothing but a carpetbag and broken hope was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who had chosen her path, who had learned that sometimes the greatest triumphs come not from grand gestures, but from the simple courage to say, "I matter, my story matters, and I choose how it ends." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the old tracks and creating space for new paths. Spring would come eventually, bringing warmth and growth and all the possibilities of a future no longer defined by the past. But for now, on this winter night, Beatrice Thorpe, no longer the rejected, no longer the shamed, but finally completely herself, closed her eyes, and smiled. She was home.